I am very excited this morning, or as a friend of mine, the late Stephen Edelman, used to say, I'm totally jazzed because I've discovered something new, and I'm going to show you the process that I go through in real time. How it happened was that I had the idea, and I've done this before for my written blog, that I would randomly select certain pieces of Mathew Franklin Whittier's and then delve into them and explain the deep context. Well, I was in the process of doing that. I'd selected two, and I wanted to show precursor works to those that were definitely Mathew's. And so I was looking them up, and I was trying to get photographs of everything to show. And I needed something from 1843. So I looked in my list of bound volumes, and I found the one that includes that span of time. And I saw a note that said, actually it was from a little bit later, but it had a note that said includes some pieces from 1843. Well, I hadn't been able to find the one I was looking for, so I thought, well, maybe it's in the back, just stray pieces, which people would sometimes, when they had these volumes bound, they might put a few other things in with them. So I got hold of it, but I got the wrong one. It actually covers some of the same years, but this one just went straight through to 1847. So I looked in the back, and I'm looking in these last issues for 1847. This is the Portland Transcript. And I saw something that I'd never seen before that I hadn't noticed. Well, this has happened because, this is 11 years worth of research. And when I started, I didn't know near as much about Mathew's work as I did later on. So the volumes that I looked through early on, I missed things because I didn't realize that he would sign with certain pseudonyms or that he used certain phrases or whatever. So let's see. There's some things, I'm in such a hurry to start this. There's a few things I'm going to have to look up and put in as graphics afterwards, but I haven't keyed these things in. So I found a whole series that Mathew had written for the 1847 Portland Transcript that I had missed. It's typical of his work. Let's see, there's a little bit of background. First of all, Mathew was personal friends with the editor of the Portland Transcript at this time, Charles Parker Isley. You can look him up. There's supposed to be one painted portrait of him. It's been lost, and I can't find it. There's an official record of it, but it's been lost. Isley is spelled I-L-S-L-E-Y, I believe, so it's a little tricky in terms of spelling. His grave is about 5 minutes from here. Maybe I'll stop by his also when I go over there. So that's one thing. Mathew had a tendency to start a series, and very often he was lampooning popular literature, the popular literature of the day. But at the same time, he wasn't content with simply lampooning. He would write in 2 layers or 3 layers or 4 layers. So he would write a silly piece lampooning somebody's silly writing, and then embedded in that would be a series of layers of serious material. Because he always covered everything with humor for the most part. Every once in a while, under an impenetrable pseudonym, he would write seriously without, from his heart, without any of the humor. So one layer might be psychological or political, but very often it was about Abby. After he lost her in 1841, he would write about her. And then underneath that might be some deeper philosophy that she had taught him or something like that, see? So he doesn't disappoint in this instance. I just found this stuff. I haven't even read it. I just dipped into it, okay? So I'm going to explore this with you in real time. Hopefully my crying is over because I burst into sobs, just half an hour ago about the poem. So here we have a lampoon of trite literature, trite journalism, and a trite publication. So he's pretending to announce the launching of a new publication, which again is a satire, and then he submits 2 or 3 pieces to this. It's like samples of what the new journal is going to hold, and they're a weird combination of serious and satirical, as Mathew typically did. And then a couple pages later is a serious poem to Abby. okay, which was what made me sob. So we're going to look at all these things. Let's see, I got to get the mouse put out of the way. Hopefully Dropbox won't give me the announcements. You might have noticed in yesterday's entry there was a few lip sync problems. I think that's because anytime this computer is trying to run another program at the same time I'm recording, my processor can't handle it, and lip sync suffers. So I was getting Dropbox notices for reasons I won't go into. Now, I have photographs. I'm going to put photographs of these things. This is the 18, I'm not sure what the range is, 1845 to 1847 Portland Transcript. And all of these are toward the back. It's a little tricky to figure out how to protect the spine when the piece you want to look at is way at the end, because you don't want to stretch the spine, too far over. But first I'm going to go to the February 13th, 1847 edition, and I'll have a photograph of this. This is an original tale written for the Portland Transcript called The Fall of Baghdad. And at this point, Matthew was occasionally signing with his full name. So all I want to do is to demonstrate to you that Mathew Franklin Whittier definitely had a robust presence in this newspaper. Okay, so we see here it's signed by M.F. Whittier, and this is one of many romantic, adventurous, swashbuckling tales set in foreign countries that Matthew wrote. Many of these didn't get published. Many of them stayed in his portfolio, and a great many of them were published by Francis Durivage under his name after he tricked Matthew out of the rights to that portfolio. I was going to go into one of those, actually, when I had Plan A, but we are now in Plan B. So maybe I just read a little tiny bit of this. The immense plain of Chaldea was parched and thirsty. For many weeks no rain had fallen, and the red sun had glared down through an atmosphere of sand, driven furiously on by the hot breath of the desert. The wells and reservoirs of Baghdad were dry, and even the waters of the Euphrates and the Tigris had become slimy and unfit for use. A caravan of Bassora merchants had just arrived, and knowing the dearth in Baghdad, several of their camels were laden with skins filled with water from some never-failing springs on the upper borders of Iraq. An immense crowd collected round the merchants as soon as they passed the gates of the city, each with a pitcher or some vessel outstretched, and each parched tongue crying for water. At first the merchants attempted to pass on unheeding, but the clamors of the multitude were so loud, and their looks and gestures became so fierce, that the leaders of the caravan hesitated and weighed the large profits that would accrue to them from the sale of the water against the probability of being torn to pieces by the frantic rabble ere they could reach the mart, and so on. So this is just an example of Matthew writing real literature under his full name, which he almost never did later on in his life. Now, we move to see if it's that edition or the next edition. It's the next edition, February 20, 1847. And on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I may be wrong here. No, I made a mistake. It's the February 26th, 1847 edition, which is the second edition after the one I just read to you. And there is a story which is unsigned that opens the paper. So some of these, I actually found one of these that was in fact Matthew's, but it's very difficult to take an unsigned piece like this and definitely claim that it's Matthew's. So generally I didn't bother with them. However, it could be his. I'd have to go back and look at it. This is called Mr. Manning's Ramble, an authentic narrative. Well, Matthew wrote stories from real life, so the fact that it's an authentic narrative could be Matthew's. I've never read it. I have to go back and look. On the second page, immediately after that article, is something written for the Portland Transcript, Legology by a Knight of the Calfskin. Now, here's where I'm going to have to go into my database and search for the phrase night of or night of thee, which I've learned how to do actually in Windows Explorer. If you want to know how to do that, you put a tilde, an equal sign, quotes, the exact phrase you're looking for, unquote. And that will allow you to search in Windows Explorer in multiple, a string of words instead of just one word. I just learned that very recently. Passed it on to Dr. Jim Tucker too, so hopefully he'll be able to use it. So I'm in a mood to name drop today. So this is a kind of tongue-in-cheek article. I haven't read it. It's a tongue-in-cheek article kind of poking fun at phrenology, which was the study of the bumps on the head to determine people's personality. Mathew was always ambivalent about that because there's no question that someone's physical appearance seems to have some tie-in to their character, and yet it's not a point-for-point thing. So what's missing in that is reincarnation, I think, because when you look at someone's physical appearance, what you're seeing is their past actions, their past attitudes, their past values. You're not seeing their present. It's taken however many incarnations to work its way out into the outward form. Abby told me the other day, she gave me the thought burst badge. It's a badge, which is kind of interesting. It's like a military medal or something. I don't know exactly how she meant the word badge, but I got the impression very clearly. It's a badge. The face is a badge from the past, So anyway, she does communicate with me, and I do get these thought bursts sometimes. Underneath legology is the line, by a knight of the calf skin. Now, I don't know what calf skin means in this case. Is that something you write on? What does he mean by calf skin? But he used this phrase, and I'll look up in my database how many times he used it in the course of his 50-year literary career, which is very instructive sometimes. If I get 2 or 3 or 4 phrases that I knew were Mathew's favorites in the same article, and I look at my database and I've got 20 for one, 13 for another, 25 for another, and 15 for the fourth one, if I've got those kind of hits in my database on those particular phrases all in one article, I can pretty much say that's Mathew because, some other author might use one, especially if he's imitating Mathew. He might use another, but you wouldn't get 4. And those authors might have used it once or twice in their whole career. Mathew's used it 15 or 20 or 27 times. See? So it's a pretty strong way, I think, of showing that Mathew was the author of some of these pieces. And that's only possible because I have all 2,300 something of Mathew's published works digitized, so they're all searchable. I'm a real researcher, just in case you're wondering. So let's read a little bit of this. This is brand new, to me. I mean, I kind of dipped into it before. That the human body is but the casement or prison house of an ethereal spirit is evident from the many ways in which that spirit exhibits itself, peeping, as it were, from its prison windows. It is also evident that although the outward frame confines, it does not control the soul. The body is but the, quote, clay in the hands of the potter. The impress of the spirit is indelibly stamped upon it and speaks through it ever. Who that has gazed upon the deserted tenement of a departed spirit has not read in the expression of that lifeless form a history of the soul's last struggle and triumph? The contracted brow, the glaring eyes, and the clenched hand tell us but too plainly the desperate energy with which the guilty and trembling soul struggled to maintain its hold upon the world, while, in another, the sweet placidness that overspreads the whole visage, the upturned eye, piercing, as it were, through the misty film of earth, far into the presence of the infinite, capital I, speaks plainer than words. The heavenly happiness of that soul's last earthly hours. The spirit has flown, but its daguerreotype is left. Now that's all serious, and Mathew would often give a serious introduction to a humorous piece. And then he goes on to introduce the science of legology. He says, but who has yet explained the philosophy of the legs? Men have talked about gaits, calling this a sprightly, that a clumsy one, but they have never penetrated beneath the surface. never discovered that a man's legs are connected with his body and that his body is governed by his spirit. But so it is. And then he goes on. So first off, you can see from this that Matthew is a mystic. He's a spiritualist and a mystic. And this he gained from Abby. Abby taught him spirituality. Before then, he was a skeptical philosopher. So now he is reiterating what Abby had taught him. This is 47. She died in 41. See? So that's one. But note that it's signed by a knight of the calfskin. Now we move to, I'll leave that in. The following edition of March 6th, 1847. And on the 5th page, on the 4th page, we see original sketches written for the Portland Transcript and in all capital letters with 3 exclamation marks, prospectus of a new magazine. So this is Matthew making fun of hype and frivolous, trite new publications, okay? But then underneath it is the byline, by a knight of the calfskin, exactly the same as the other one. So we are on notice that whoever wrote that earlier one on legology has also written this one on a new topic, see? So I'm going to start reading this. I have not read this yet. It's long, and it contains several sample articles in this prospected magazine, okay? So we start with this one. The dawn of a bright day is breaking upon the literature of America. Her long vassalage to the aristocratic and bigoted minds of the old world, the classics in other words, will soon be at an end, and the empire of intellect will extend itself with rapid strides in emulation of the onward march of progressive democracy, capital D. Too long has America been in the leading strings of Europe. Too long has her brilliant genius bowed at the nod of the tilted literati of the rotten monarchies. Now she boldly proclaims her spiritual freedom, makes her second declaration of independence, and, freed from the fetters which have so long bound her, spreads her ethereal wings for a long, a lofty, and a glorious flight. And then he puts in brackets and italics. Whew, that will take. In other words, he's joking about the fact that he has made an excellent introduction, long-winded introduction to this new magazine thing. And then he goes on, the leading characteristic of this glorious beginning of a glorious end is the universal diffusion of the spirit of capital L literature. In the old world, it is but occasionally that a toiling, plodding soul climbs the steep sides of Parnassus and stands at last a worn-out spirit on its dim summit. Here it is otherwise. I'll do one more paragraph. The rugged sides and steep precipices of Parnassus, in conformity to the spirit of our institutions, are leveled down to the capacity of all. In other words, dumbed down to the lowest common denominator, he's saying, and present the beautiful aspect of an immense, smooth plain, upon which the fiery rays of the sun and capital G genius may beat uninterruptedly. And then in brackets and italics again, that will do for the lower 10 million. In other words, he's saying that America, ignoring the classics in Europe, is striking out on a new course of inane trite literature, okay? So this is all satire. And it goes on like that with these little asides. Then it says, let's see, with this exposition of our principles and our intended course, we submit to the approbation of a discerning public the first number of the, all caps, large type, Independent Humdrum Magazine. So that's the title of the magazine, the Independent Humdrum Magazine. Now we have the first article. It's called The Cruel Father, A Tale of True Love, written for the Humdrum Magazine by Solomon Soaplocks. So this is a satirical piece. I'm going to read some of it. I haven't read any of this at all. 'Twas a beautiful evening in June. All nature seemed wrapped in an Elysium dream. The moon, pale mistress of the night, softly flung her veil of light upon the sleeping landscape. The tall old oaks stood somber and dun, doing the duty of sentinels of the night. And the little lake, cradled at the foot of the hill, seemed smiling in its dreams as the moonbeams kissed its shining countenance. All was motionless in that fair valley, and if nature might be believed, all was peace. But alas, that it should be so. The face of nature is seldom a true index of what is passing upon its surface. Though the earth rejoices, the human heart may be sad. At least, so thought one fair being, as with pensive brow she gazed upon a distant star, the star of her destiny, and troubled thoughts heaved her fair bosom. Now what's happening here, Matthew's done this many times, he is telling what is supposed to be a caricature of literature. It's actually a story about Abby that he's hiding under the humor. This is actual autobiography. And this is when I wrote my novel, Twin Souls Descended. That's how I got 95% of the information from Matthew's encoded personal accounts. Now keep in mind that in 1847, Matthew was still married to his second wife, Jane Vaughn, which marriage was arranged sight unseen by his mother. I have pretty much put together what must have happened. She did go to seances. I think it was Esther Carter was a friend of hers that took her to seances back, about 1842 when Matthew remarried. I think that she told Matthew that Abby had come through in one of these seances and instructed him to marry the woman that his mother was going to pick for him. And that is the only reason Matthew would ever have done such a thing. I think he had intended to stay unmarried the rest of his life and wait for her, but he wanted to obey Abby's wishes. And he was confused about whether she wanted him to remarry. That's a long story. There's a poem that tells the story, published in the Portland Tribune. Apparently, she started bringing up the idea that maybe if he died, maybe if she died, he might want to remarry. And he said, no, he wouldn't want to. Would she want to? This is all what I feel, what I remember by emotional memory. And she said, being defensive, she said, well, I might. And then he got all upset, that this girl who had been talking about them as twin stars and soulmates, would suddenly start talking about that she might remarry. And he got all jealous. Well, it had nothing to do with any of that. It had to do with the fact that she had probably coughed up some blood in a handkerchief unknown to him. And she realized that her consumption, her tuberculosis had come back and that she was going to die. And she was prescient anyway, so she knew she was going to die, and she didn't want Matthew to struggle with that and to be all alone. So she was broaching the subject that he might want to remarry because she couldn't tell him that she was going to die, see? And he took it a totally different place and got jealous, and, so I remembered all of that. But here, what he's telling is the story. There's some point I was making that I've forgotten. I'm going to move on. He's telling the story of how her father wouldn't approve their marriage. Now, you have to understand that her father was a marquis. That's like above an earl, above a count. So his family had a connection to the royal family in France. I think one of their relatives was like in charge of the whole household or something like that. I forget what you call such a person. I didn't shut off my heater. I apologize if the noise comes on. So he had to flee a slave uprising in 1792 with his father and cousin and some other family. But he really still stayed loyal to the aristocracy in France. But Abby was a complete rebel in this regard. She wanted nothing to do with her family heritage or her family money, which all came from slavery. She renounced all of that, and she wanted to marry Matthew, who was a farmer's son, poor Quaker farm boy. He had nobility of spirit, which is all she cared about. But, he had no social standing. So her father refused, and they had to elope. It took me a long time to figure this out. They eloped to Dover, New Hampshire. So he's telling that story. Let's see. I'm going to jump down. It's talking about, well, here it says, at least so thought one fair being, as with pensive brow she gazed upon a distant star, the star of her destiny, and troubled thoughts heaved her fair bosom. Who shall describe the emotions of that heavenly creature as she turned her mind back to the past? The bright hours of her childhood rose before her. How joyous they were! How quickly they flew by! Then she remembered the new world which rose before her vision as she entered maidenhood, and the bright colors in which it was clothed. But one hour of her life shone forth with a peculiar radiance. It was the hour when her heart first throbbed under the admiring gaze of him upon whom the whole sum of her earthly happiness seemed now depending. And with what a chaste and ecstatic pleasure did she gaze upon his manly form, whose image was enthroned in her heart. But alas! Here the scene darkened as the heavy clouds of parental displeasure lowered upon it. The stern fate of her father rose before her, and she sunk beneath its glance. What! His only darling child wed the son of his sworn enemy? Never! The old man swore it with a fearful oath. But she, that guileless maiden, what knew she of hatred or of foes? Alas, she knew only to love. And then it went on like that. I haven't read this, so I don't know what the gist of it is, but I will tell you that it roughly parallels Matthew and Abby's real history. So there's many examples like that. This is a new one on me. You'll notice that the stars are mentioned, that Abby loved the stars. I've gone over this. I've mentioned this over and over and over, that whenever we talk about Abby, the stars are going to come in, and you'll see that with bells on in just a minute. Now, at the bottom of this, it says to be continued, which I don't know if it ever was or not. Probably not. And then there's a poem called June, written for the Humdrum magazine by Miss Seraphina Scraggs. So we're on notice that this is going to be a silly poem, very lightweight, right? And yet, Abby was born in June 2nd. So he mixes the satire and the caricature with hidden code for real life in a very intricate way. It's taken me a long time to figure out his method. So I'm going to read this poem. So it begins, June, written for the Humdrum magazine by Miss Seraphina Scraggs. How gaily sing the sweet little birds in the month of June. How peaceful and calm the lowing herds pass the sultry noon. But the cooler breath of evening comes when the moon shines bright, and the farmers rest in their quiet homes, where they pass the night. That's in italics for some reason. Thus stand I in the June of life, and hope's sun shines clear, and afar is now the world's great strife, for my true love's near. Oh, when youth's sun hath set at last in the night of age, may love's flag be nailed to my mast as I leave the stage. So this is horrible poetry, and yet this is Abby speaking, as he's making a caricature of bad poetry in bad magazines. Immediately under that, he hasn't finished yet. An essay on American literature, written for the Humdrum magazine by Lazarus Lightbrain. It's a great synonym. Lazarus Lightbrain. And I have not read this, so let's see what he's getting at here. In treating of the literature of America, it is much the habit of certain writers to dwell particularly upon the works of a certain class of authors, while they totally neglect and overlook a large and respectable body of writers whose claims upon the public notice are equal, if not superior, to those who are thus held up before the eyes of the people. Now, he's talking, I don't know if he's talking about bad authors, but at the same time, he's talking about himself, which is to say, he's writing genius level work and he's ignored. Well, partly he's ignored because he won't tell anybody he's writing, but the one that I showed you first, he did sign with his own name. So he's being ignored and it bothers him, So he's talking about himself. At the same time, he's talking about hack writers who are ignored and think they ought to be important. So he's taking both identities at the same time. Indeed, I do not see the justice or propriety of calling the former class American authors. What constitutes an American author? What makes anything truly American? It is not the evidence of something original, Is it not the evidence of something original in itself, something pure and fresh from the hand of genius? This preeminent requisite the writers under notice essentially lack. There is a lingering regard for the flesh-pots of the old world, manifest in all their imagery, a yearning for the men, customs, and scenes of olden time. They have not yet learned to trust the new light as the guide for their feet in the paths of literature. Hence, they are not the true exponents of the new era of mind, which is in progress upon this Western continent. They are the men of the past. In their backward gazing, the present is lost to them. The present, with all its rich fruit and budding promises, is left for the possession of another class of authors, and it is of this class that I propose to write. So then, I don't know if I should bore you guys to death by going on about this. I have to read it to really understand what he's getting at, because it's going to be multi-layered. I'll jump down a little bit. This is misspelled. There's a typo here. The magnanimity of soul displayed by the high-minded authors of these imperishable works is equal to the brilliancy of their genius. Disdaining to contaminate themselves with, quote, filthy lucre, their works are given to the people for, I had almost said, the cost of publishing. True, they are put in a less substantial form than the works of other writers, and manifestly to the advantage of the people it is, meaning published in these journals, newspapers. For it is evident that as these works are easily destroyed, a vacuum is created for the sale of more of them, thus giving the people a constant supply of healthful mental food. Among so many who are worthy of notice, it would be invidious to particularize, but I cannot resist the inclination to point out the merits of one of this class of writers. Professor Lackworth has claims upon our attention which cannot be overlooked. I cannot, and neither do I intend to, do him justice in this slight sketch in which I shall barely touch upon him. And it goes on. And he's making fun of Professor Lackworth, and yet he's also speaking as himself. So that's the way Matthew works on different levels. Now we move over to the April 3rd, 1847 edition. In the 4th page, in the poetry corner, underneath the heading Poetry, I forgot to put this marker in, there's a poem called Night. It's signed Lyra. It says inscribed to blank. I'll put that up on the screen. I'm going to read this. When I read it, I felt something and I thought something, and my feeling, intuition, and my head were not in agreement. Because I felt this is Matthew writing about Abby, or to Abby. And I looked at the style. It's not a known style that Matthew usually wrote in. Lyra sounds feminine. I assumed it was feminine, not knowing what it was. I said, well, I don't think that's probably, I'm probably grasping at straws and so on. But my heart says, I think this is Matthew writing to Abby. I was right. My heart was right, as it almost always is. So I'm going to read this. Now, I totally forgot something, which I think I'll try to insert at the proper place rather than to tag it on the end, because I think people might not get to the end. So what I forgot was to go into what the signature Lyra means, because Matthew would sign in ways that were meaningful. He always embedded code in these things. So I didn't know what Lyra was. I'd heard of it. Of course, I thought it had to do something with a lyre. Lyre meaning the instrument. So I looked it up, and forgive me, I just went to Wikipedia for a quick fix. Normally I try to go to something else, but it says Lyra is a small constellation. So that fits with the poem. It is one of 48 listed by the 2nd century astronomer Ptolemy, and is one of the 88 constellations recognized by the International Astronomical Union. Lyra was often represented on star maps as a vulture or an eagle carrying a lyre, and hence is sometimes referred to as vulture cadens or aquila cadens, falling vulture or falling eagle, respectively. Beginning at the north, Lyra is bordered by, and it goes on like that. Now let's see. In Greek mythology, which Abby taught Matthew extensively in Greek mythology and Greek philosophy, that was a big part of her curriculum when she tutored him. In Greek mythology, Lyra represents the lyre of Orpheus. Now we're on target here. Made by Hermes from a tortoiseshell given to Apollo as a bargain. It was said to be the first lyre ever produced. Orpheus's music was said to be so great that even inanimate objects such as trees, streams, and rocks could be charmed. Joining Jason and the Argonauts, his music was able to quell the voices of the dangerous sirens who sang tempting songs to the Argonauts. At one point, Orpheus married Eurydice, I don't know how you pronounce that, Eurydice, a nymph. Now, Matthew often talked about Abby as a water nymph or a river sprite. While fleeing from an attack by Aristaeus, she stepped on a snake that bit her, killing her. To reclaim her, Orpheus entered the underworld, where the music from his lyre charmed Hades. Hades relented and let Orpheus bring Eurydice back, on the condition that he never once looked back until outside. Unfortunately, near the very end, Orpheus faltered and looked back, calling Eurydice to be left in the underworld forever. Orpheus spent the rest of his life strumming his lyre while wandering aimlessly through the land, rejecting all marriage offers from women. That's what Matthew is referring to when he signs with that signature. Not just the star and the heavens, but that particular myth. In the to correspondence section, where the editor writes to people who have submitted work, either telling them yours is accepted or we can't take yours or whatever, he says Lyra is welcome to our columns, something like that, which means that Matthew's friend, Charles Isley, did not know that Matthew had written this poem. So he would continue to submit work anonymously, and it would continue to get accepted because it was so good, and they didn't know who it was. That's how The Raven got accepted in American Review under blank Quarles, I think. So here we have inscribed to blank, period. The heavens are clear and brightly beaming, gem-like the stars illume the night, while, like a barge of silver seeming, the moon pours down her mellow light. No sound disturbs the quiet hour, a hush pervades the evening air, and bound as by some secret power, all nature seems engaged in prayer. Oh, in this hour so still and holy, my heart discards each low desire, with spirits calm, subdued and lowly, to heaven my chastened thoughts aspire. Would thou wert here, that we might ponder the glorious beauty of the night. Oh, sweet it were with thee to wander beneath this dome of sparkling light, this gorgeous dome of crystal arching and bright and starry splendor dressed, and watch the heavenly host slow marching in shining order to the west. Would thou wert here, my lone heart yearneth amid this glowing pageantry, and my rapt soul from heaven returneth communion sweet to hold with thee. As I burst into sobs reading this before, I started to feel it, squelched it toward the end. Here we have absolutely that Matthew and Abby would wander under the stars, and that it was the height of bliss to be with her like that, you know. And this is 6 years after her death. He's emotionally pulling back from his attempts to be in that second arranged marriage. And she is starting to contact him, as we saw, I think it was yesterday. And he's writing to her about communing with her under the stars the way that they used to do. So what he's done, again, is he's introduced a series which is satire, ostensibly on the surface layer, about superficial literature and newspapers. But in it, he's put himself, and he's put his story of how he and Abby, had to elope, basically. And then he's got a silly poem, which is actually Abby because it's June, which is her birthday. And now he's got a full-blown serious poem under a completely different pseudonym that no one will ever recognize to her, completely come out of hiding, except, in terms of the literature, but the pseudonym now is impenetrable, so he's still in hiding. He does this over and over and over. I've seen this pattern. So there may be more of him in the back here. I'll have to go through this whole section again. But that gives you an idea of how Mathew works and the quality of his writing and who we're dealing with. And this is something that it also shows you how I've gone through this research process of stumbling on things seemingly by accident. I don't know if it's really by accident because this is the day after Valentine's Day. And I suspect this is Abby's Valentine's Day present, one day late, that she somehow or other, I don't know how she does this, but she can kind of tip the table, like if it's a billiard game, she explains it as billiards, where she hits one ball and that ball hits another ball and that ball hits another ball, and it goes into the pocket. That's the way she does this. But I think she tilts the table too. And I don't know how she does that, but somehow or other, she makes me run into things. And could be coincidence, but I've been doing this 11 years, and I personally say it's way over coincidence, So I think this is Abby's Valentine's Day present to me, to find that poem. So maybe next time or at some future time, I will once again go back to randomly chosen pieces. I wanted that element of spontaneity, but I think this was like way better in terms of spontaneity than what I was planning on doing. And sometimes it happens that way. So I hope you found this interesting. I see that a few people are actually watching these, maybe up to 8 people are taking a look at this and a couple new subscribers. I don't know. Praveen Mohan has 1 million. I got 8, up from 7. Yeah. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you again for watching.